Beta Kiryu, Beta Ichiban, and Beta Yagami. RGG Studio is known for their consistent release of Yakuza games. I mean, it's practically an annual schedule. This leaves about 1 to 2 years of development for each game, and in some cases, just a couple of months. That's faster than literally any game franchise I can think of, and by this upcoming January, they would have released 3 games in a 12-month period. Of course, this fast-paced development cycle leads to all sorts of drastic beta designs and remnants of the development process finding their way into the final game. So today, that's exactly what we're gonna explore. But first, a quick word for our sponsor. Hey Kyodai, do you browse the internet as much as I do?
Hi.
Well then let me introduce you to Surfshark VPN. Surfshark keeps your internet traffic safe and private online, while also letting you travel around the world in just one click. Yes, you heard that right. So if you're an otaku like me, all you have to do is connect to the Japanese server and boom, you instantly have access to any content that's not accessible in your own country. This includes restricted YouTube videos and entire streaming catalogs like Netflix, allowing you full freedom on the internet. And if you're traveling abroad, you have the ability to connect back to your home country, so you never miss out on any of your home comforts anywhere. You even get a 30-day money-back guarantee, and if you click the link in the description, use the code TURTLE to get up to an additional 6 months on your plan for free. Yup, it's that great of a deal. They are also kind enough to sponsor me, so I encourage you guys to support them. A big thank you to Surfshark, and let's get back to the video. So our journey starts with the very first Yakuza game. You might be surprised to know that there's actually an entire novel based around the origins of this game. Luckily it became the hit that Sega wanted, but what if I told you that the original story for Yakuza 1 was actually supposed to be a lot darker and violent than what we actually got? In this development novel, Nagoshi detailed his desire for Yakuza 1 to be a much more mature game than what Sega had produced before. In his own words, he explained how he wanted to create a powerful, gritty drama where you feel the sense of humanity, with his target audience dead set on being older Japanese men. And so of course, the main character's ages were built around that archetype. Nagoshi's initial proposal to Sega was a dark story about an invincible Yakuza that gets tied to a shady Yakuza plot set in a fully explorable town based off a red light district of Kabukicho. The core plan was to touch on love, empathy, and betrayal, touching on all sides of human drama. We don't know the exact specifics of this original story, but Sega's response to his proposal was immediate. There's no way a game like that will sell. In order to replicate the success of companies like Nintendo, making games for children was still the priority for Sega, and a violent drama about older men just didn't align with their goals. But luckily one day, Nagoshi had a chance meeting with Masayoshi Kikuchi. He was the only person at Sega that thought the idea was interesting, adding back to Nagoshi's idea by proposing to add a little girl into the story. After a little back and forth, the new proposal was set. The story was about a legendary Yakuza and a young girl brought together in a bizarre drama. Nagoshi had bet his entire career on the success of the game, Sega approved, and the rest is history. But I wonder what the original story would have been like. Without Haruka, what could the story have possibly been about? Well, I think the story would have been a lot more Yakuza oriented. We might have seen a few fingers fly off people's hands, and all sorts of bizarre Yakuza antics that we get a glimpse of in later games. Adding Haruka into the mix definitely changed a lot about the story, and I wonder if the series would have still been as successful had Sega approved the original story. But now that Nagoshi has his own studio, he's already stated his intent to make a violent Tarantino-like game. I'm curious to see where he'll go with narratives without Sega telling him what he can and can't do. Now let's set the record straight. Yakuza 3 was an incredible achievement in game development. It's notorious for its 3-week project phase followed by just 8 months of active development. They had to create a total of 360 characters, and after taking what they learned from Kenzan, they were on a 3 days per body target schedule. There was only about 60 members on their in-house design team, and about a dozen of them were in charge of creating the characters. The first 2 Yakuza games actually took longer to develop. But 3D digitizing streamlined this process and made it much easier to create characters than it did for the PS2 games. When it came to the English release of Yakuza 3, a lot of side content had been removed. And I mean a lot of side content. Entire minigames were gone, which included shogi and mahjong. The hostess maker and hostess clubs were completely gone too, as well as 22 sub-stories. The reasoning behind this was simply that there was a tight schedule for the English release. And so they just decided to get rid of most of the content based around Japanese culture. But that's not it, because modders have since digged into the files and uncovered some interesting content that was left over from development. Like the fact that there's a Kamurocho testing stage, in which I guess they made a recreation of the Kabukicho gate area, featuring photorealistic textures of actual Japanese buildings and brands. After all, this was the team's first attempt at a PS3 Kamurocho. So I do kinda wonder if they were thinking of rebooting the map in some kind of way and making it even more faithful to Kabukicho. But this stage was either a testing ground for that idea or simply an early proof of concept. Regardless, it's pretty cool to me and a cool alternative look of a location that's mostly unchanged in every game. There's also an unused gameplay model of Daigo in the files, not wearing his regular suit though. Instead, he's wearing Shoyo Toma's suit. I think this was probably just an early design for Daigo. It's interesting that it's a gameplay model though. Maybe at some point of development, they wanted him to be a playable character. It isn't too far-fetched of an idea, considering the next game literally introduced multiple protagonists. There's also the possibility that it might have been for a battle where you fight Daigo, but given the story, I just don't see how and where it would fit. All in all, I find it pretty impressive considering they were able to achieve all of this in only 8 months of production, even though it's probably the most disliked Yakuza game. Yakuza 4's development sure was a roller coaster. You might think most of the stories come from the expansion of Kamurocho, where they added the rooftops and the underground, but no, most of the public trivia surrounds the protagonists. It's said that each protagonist was assigned to different composers on the team to create even more contrast between them. The composers weren't allowed to contribute to the soundtrack of any other character other than the one they were assigned to. It's not something I really noticed when I played through the game, but it's a cool detail regardless, and I'm probably gonna pay more attention to the soundtrack whenever I replay the game. While I was researching for more trivia, I came across a specific Reddit post that caught my attention. The OP states that they had seen 2 different forums where commenters stated that the studio were not planning to have Kiryu in Yakuza 4 at all. A comment below has some more information about this rumor. TLDR is that allegedly, Kiryu's story was supposed to end in Yakuza 3. They wanted a new series lead, but they ended up not risking Kiryu being absent while they looked for the right successor. I've looked far and wide online to try find a source to all this information, but I just haven't found anything concrete. If anyone has sources to all this and can prove if this is true or not, please comment down below so the rest of us can learn about this whole situation. But for now, I'm gonna take this as 100% rumor. Even though I find it interesting and it makes total sense to me. Kiryu essentially had a trilogy before Yakuza 4, and running an orphanage in Okinawa was the perfect place for him to retire. There's also the possibility that Kiryu was just meant to be a cameo during Saejima's section of the game, and perhaps the team then decided that he should just be the 4th playable character instead. So yeah, again, hopefully someone in the comments can tell us more about this rumor. A lot of you might not know this, but back when the PS Vita was unveiled, one of the games they previewed to showcase its power was Yakuza Dead Souls. Yup, a native version of Yakuza Dead Souls running on the PS Vita. Not much was heard about this after, but given Kuryo's success, I think it's safe to assume that RGG Studio were considering making games for the Vita. Perhaps a full-on port of Dead Souls to kick things off. I mean, the graphics themselves are pretty on par with the PS3 games, so it must have been a consideration for the team. But the Vita ended up being a flop, and ended up not as powerful as initially advertised. These 2 reasons are probably why we never saw any RGG games on the Vita. The development of Yakuza 5 was set out to be ambitious from the very start. Having more time for development than the average Yakuza game, the studio announced ahead of time that Yakuza 5 would be set across 5 different locations, featuring an all-new engine, with each location aiming to be around the same size of Sotenbori and Okinawa, if not larger. And as we saw from the final game, they pretty much succeeded. Yakuza 5 was also marketed as a soft reboot for the series, since of course they were 5 games into a franchise and wanted the number to be a bit more approachable to newcomers. But at the same time, some say that the story of the game kinda felt like a grand finale to the previous games. In the game files themselves, modders have learnt that Kiryu's charging function from Yakuza 3 and 4 was still left over and fully functional, but just unused. It's speculated that Kiryu's combat is already OP in 5, so they decided to cut this entirely. There's also a completely unused quick boxing moveset that was intended for the generic goon. Due to the series picking up traction in the West with Yakuza 0, information and trivia about the series development got more accessible in English, like the fact that there was a Walkman DLC for the Japan-only PS3 edition of 0. You were able to load up songs from the game's soundtrack and play them while you walked around the city. Honestly, this is such a cool part of the game, and I have no clue why it was only released in Japan and on the PS3. I saw a similar feature present in Infinite Wealth though, and I honestly have no clue how it took so long to implement this again in their games. 0 was also the first Yakuza game to release on PC, which meant fans were able to dive deeper than before and uncover all sorts of secrets. Remember how 0 made you save at the phone boxes? Well, there was strangely a patch that removed the ability to save from your menu. I guess they just wanted more immersion in the game, but it's a little annoying how the feature was there and was removed via a patch. Yakuza 6 was the first Dragon Engine game, and since it released just a year after 0 and a few months after Kiwami, it meant that the game was kinda rushed. It also happened to feature a completely new engine, with graphics that still hold up to this day. The ambition with this game was in its design and mechanics, thus the story was much simpler than prior Yakuza games, and a bit disappointing for some people. When it came to development though, they definitely cut corners when it came to Kamurocho, since Champions District and the entire Northern Street were completely cut from the map. I can't really blame the studio, since they were already on a tight schedule and pumping out great games regardless, but it is what it is. There was also a demo that released that showed off a different design for Kiryu. I love the fact that Kiryu has his classic clothing in the final game, but I'd be lying if I said the demo design didn't make more sense. He's been out of the Yakuza for a while now, and there's no point narrative-wise where he needs to be in his classic suit, other than the fact that it looks cool. Modders have been able to play around with this demo and explore Kamurocho beyond the playable area. It's pretty interesting to see Kamurocho in such a beta stage. Players have noticed that Kamurocho's underground locations are present and located directly under the map, which implies there was supposed to be much more of Kamurocho to explore with seamless transitions, but that just wasn't the case in the final game. The English release of the demo was a lot messier. Fans noticed that the demo file size was oddly much bigger than most full games at the time, and within the first day, it was clear why. They accidentally released the entire game. Yup, the whole game was in the demo, and fans began playing through the entire game. A couple hours later, Sega pulled the game and disabled all installed copies of the demo, making headlines all over the internet. The demo's exploits were fixed, and it re-released a month after the incident. Information about Yakuza Kiwami is a bit scarce because it was more like a fun project for the team, being built between Yakuza 0 and 6, with the latter being the priority of the studio at the time. Kiwami was also mostly just a copy of 0's engine, just with a first game story. They did add the extra Nishiki scenes and Majima everywhere, as well as adding a couple events to expand on 0. But the most interesting part comes from the game's files. Modders have found that Yakuza 3's antagonist Mine has a model in the files. This had to have been intentional, because the last time Mine had been in the game was Yakuza 3 itself. Players speculate that he might have been a character in a sub-story at first, similar to how Yakuza 0 had surprise cameos, but there was never an explanation for it. If I had to guess though, the studio probably had scheduling conflicts with the actor since they already had their hands full with development. Now Kiwami 2 was pretty interesting because it was developed alongside Judgment, and because of that, there's a lot of Judgment data left over in the files. There's beta walking and running animations for Yagami, as well as beta Tiger and Crane movesets. A lot of early UI from Judgment is also present, such as the drone UI, the tailing UI, and even the skill upgrade UI, but the most noteworthy piece of data here is the beta Yagami model. This is the early design for Yagami before Kimura was cast in the role. In general, they just had slightly more time to develop Kamurocho, so they were able to include the Northern Street, as well as Champions District. We've seen most of Judgment's beta designs in Kiwami 2, but there's some interesting stuff still left over in the Judgment game itself, like the fact that the ADDC Center has an unused Popo store inside of it. There isn't really a single point in the story where this is needed, so I'm kind of curious what the original use case of it was. There's also a surprising amount of detail outside the center, making me wonder if there was originally plans to let you explore the surrounding area, both outside and inside the center. It would explain the unused Popo as a means to buy and gather items. Maybe Yagami spent more time here in the original plans, and this area was gonna play a bigger part of the gameplay. Not long before the English release of Judgment, the voice actor for Hamura was detained on coke charges. This broke Japanese headlines and led to the original Hamura's voice and face being replaced with a new actor. Also, random fun fact, Hamura's original voice actor was also the voice of Olaf in Kingdom Hearts before the incident. Yakuza Like a Dragon was finally the reboot RGG Studio had been trying to make since Yakuza 5, introducing a fresh protagonist and bringing a whole new vibe to the series. And oh boy, the game underwent a lot of changes through development. This one probably has the juiciest development trivia from all of them, so strap in. Our journey begins in mid-2017, a year after Yakuza 6 released, which was promoted as the finale to Kiryu's story. The studio had revealed Ichiban Kasuga, the new series lead and successor to Kiryu, who would debut in Shin RGG. They made a trailer to go with the announcement, and we got our first look at Beta Ichiban. This is not how Ichiban looked in the final game, and the reasoning for the change went undisclosed. But given the more expressive emotions we got in 7, we can assume the reasoning was for easier motion capture. On April Fool's 2019, the studio dropped an April Fool's trailer, which was basically a concept for a turn-based online Yakuza game. Up till then, every Yakuza game was a beat-em-up, so seeing this lit a spark and desire for a turn-based Yakuza game. And not long after, the studio announced that 7 would be the first fully turn-based combat game of the series, and their reasoning was that the reception from the April Fool's trailer made them switch the combat of the entire game. Despite most people taking the studio's word on this, I personally think they always intended for 7 to be turn-based, and that the April Fool's trailer was just a marketing ploy to get people interested. I just don't see how and why they would change the gameplay in less than a year from release just because some fans wanted a turn-based game. The entire story is also built on being a Dragon Quest inspired game, and to me, it doesn't seem like they ever had the intent of making it a beat-em-up. Though it has been said that the general theme of having a party was inspired by the developers wanting to make a one-piece game. If we go back to the April Fool's trailer, there's 4 playable characters on screen. At the time, we only knew Ichiban, and by release, we knew that Sayako, but what about the other 2? Well, I think they might have been Beta Nanba and Adachi designs. If Nanba and Adachi were fully designed by this point, I think it would have been weird to not include them. And I mean, you can't tell me that's not giving Nanba vibes. Once Yakuza 7 released on PC, modders were once again able to dive into the files and reveal more interesting details. One of the most interesting things for me is the fact that there's data for Ichiban using a skateboard. This never appeared in the final game, but it did appear in the game that released after, which was Lost Judgment. I'm pretty bummed that a skateboard skateboard wasn't in 7 because I feel like the game could have really used it, and there was already data for Ichiban specifically to use it, but it's okay. There's also data for Ichiban using lockpicks, which was a feature in Judgment. However, it went unused in the final game. There's also unused karaoke files. They don't contain any sounds or animations, but it shows that Jungi was gonna be able to sing Machine Gun Kiss at some point. For some reason it was scrapped, and Jungi never had a song in the game. Ichiban also had some extra songs, including Machine Gun Kiss and Bakamitai. It's bizarre to me how we could have had an Ichiban Bakamitai, and it sucks that we didn't get it. But since there's already labels for this data, I do wonder if these karaoke songs were once planned as DLC. Oddly enough, there's also female enemy portraits in the files. Despite there being no female enemies in the game, I'm gonna assume these are placeholders, but hey, maybe it could have been an idea at some point. There's also enemy portraits for characters you never fight in the game, most notable to me being Daigo. There's also data of 3 removed playable characters, Sakaida, Hoshino, and Ayaka. These are the names in Ichiban's party in the April Fool's trailer, and since they're in the files of the actual game, I think it adds fuel to the idea that these were just beta names for Ichiban's beta party. Since Yakuza 7's Kamurocho was built directly on top of Judgment, you can still find locations from Judgment on the map, with some being fully rendered. Amongst these includes Yagami's Detective Agency, Genda Law Office, the Arcade, and KJ Arts. Funnily enough, you can also find cube maps under these locations. As far as I know, there aren't any other locations that have this, so I find it pretty interesting. And there you have it, a rundown of development stories throughout the whole Yakuza series. Be sure to tell me the most interesting thing you learned from this video, and if you think I missed any key stuff, I'd appreciate if you could comment it down below. And if you made it this far, I would really appreciate if you could leave a like or maybe subscribe. This video took me a while to make, and I tried to find as much information as I could to share with you guys. And if you're interested, maybe I could do this with another game franchise someday. We'll see, but for now, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next one.